There are few episodes in recent history that haunt world politics like the fall of Yugoslavia. Most of the territory of this disintegrating country fell into a nasty war, which was disturbing enough to see in Europe in the 1990s. But in Bosnia, it was something else. It was genocide. Serbia, the most powerful of the former Yugoslav republics, the one that retained the old country's army, worked through the Bosnian Serbs to attempt to annihilate the Bosnian Muslims, who, unlike the also targeted Bosnian Croats, had no place to go. Throughout the first Bush and Clinton administrations, as the horror grew, it became more and more humiliating for the U.S. policymakers who claimed to be leading a new, more humane world order. Bosnia in the 1990s, the horror and the humiliation, was a formative experience for the foreign policy professionals who now run the U.S. military-industrial complex. They promised themselves that they would never let anything like it happen again. Well, they failed, because what is happening in Yemen today is much worse than what happened in Bosnia, both in terms of human lives and the cost to America's moral standing. All of these numbers are suspect, of course. Around 100,000 is the estimate for Bosnia deaths provided by Encyclopedia Britannica. That means that over 3 times as many people have died in the Yemen war so far, but maybe Encyclopedia Britannica is wrong. Older estimates, such as the numbers provided in Samantha Power's book, A Problem from Hell, leaned closer to 200,000 dead in Bosnia. But even with those larger numbers, almost twice as many people have been killed in Yemen. And that's assuming the UN's estimate of 377,000 deaths is accurate. Unlike Bosnia in the 1990s, Yemen has a desperately poor, predominantly rural population. Bosnians in the 1990s were much richer and more capable of communicating what was happening to them. And in recent weeks, the Saudi terror bombing of civilians in Yemen's capital has stepped up dramatically, and Hodeidah, the country's main port for humanitarian aid, is being fought over once again. That 377,000 figure from November 2021 is already woefully out of date. The power relations of what is happening in Yemen are similar to Bosnia as well, though again, what is happening in Yemen is significantly worse. In both countries, we saw a foreign invasion that hides behind the legitimacy of local militia forces. When Yugoslavia collapsed, Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic made sure that the Bosnian Serbs had privileged access to the weapons of the dissolving military. Throughout the murderous conflict in Bosnia, Milosevic would often pretend that Serbia, a country neighboring Bosnia, had nothing to do with the crimes of the Bosnian Serb militias, despite the fact that he was continuously providing diplomatic support. The Saudi coalition isn't polite enough to cover up what they are doing. They heavily bomb Yemen with their own planes, on behalf of a disorderly riot of militias running around parts of Yemen very few people live in support of an internationally recognized government that has spent almost the entire conflict based in the Saudi capital. On a map of Yemen, it looks like the Saudi coalition controls a lot, but that's because the country is mostly desert. I do not believe Saudi Arabia's Yemeni puppets have ever controlled more than 10 to 15% of Yemen's population, and they certainly don't control that much now. Aden, the one big Yemeni city the Saudis briefly held, rebelled against their puppet government. Aden is now controlled by another coalition of militias that seem to be collaborating with the Saudis at the moment, but that is unlikely to last. Serbia's Slobodan Milosevic was a monster, but he at least had the decency to pretend he wasn't invading the country next door. Saudi Arabia is operating an open Saddam Hussein in Kuwait-style invasion, and the United States is not doing anything to stop it. In fact, we are supporting this invasion, and we have been doing so for almost 7 years. The Bosnian Serbs committed horrible crimes, but they had a vastly more legitimate presence in Bosnia than the Saudi coalition does in Yemen. There actually was a long-standing Serb presence in Bosnia, with real ethnic interests to protect, no matter how evil their genocidal actions were. What Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen is straight-up imperialism and, importantly, spectacularly unsuccessful imperialism at that. Their Houthi enemies have controlled 80 to 85% of the country's population throughout this horrific war. The conflict in Bosnia produced some of the most shocking images of the second half of the 20th century. Militia members casually kicking old women in the street, concentration camps, traumatized women hanging themselves, and mass graves filled with bound and blindfolded skeletons. I think a case can be made that the genocidal Serb militias were more evil on the individual level than the mass-murdering Saudi pilots and the U.S. companies that keep the Saudi planes flying. But this is largely because the Serb militias occasionally won victories. The Saudis don't. The Saudi coalition has been so spectacularly unsuccessful that it has never controlled a significant civilian population in Yemen. It has reacted to its failure to set up individual concentration camps by turning the entire country into a concentration camp. I don't believe in forcing my audience to look at images of dead and dying children, but that is the main legacy of Saudi policy in Yemen over the past 7 years. If you can stomach it, I urge you to seek those pictures out. Saudi warships have only been able to completely shut down Yemen's ports on a few occasions. The world is callous, but not callous enough to allow that. But since 2015, the Saudis, supported by the United States and the United Kingdom, have attempted to block all uninspected and unapproved commerce. The Saudis and their hirelings in Washington, D.C. will tell you that humanitarian assistance still gets through. But any honest commentator will tell you that an outside blockade makes it impossible to serve a country's needs adequately. The United Nations can usually get food through. A normal business person who wants to serve Yemen's needs for food, fertilizer, and agricultural equipment can't, or just won't because the Saudis make it unprofitable. The piles of dead children make that abundantly clear. Of the 400,000 dead, most are innocent civilians that have either starved to death or died of preventable diseases because of malnutrition. These people have died at the hands of the U.S. Saudi blockade, which is less photogenic but just as monstrous as anything Slobodan Milosevic did to Bosnia. And again, this is an invasion. Saudi Arabia has no right to be controlling the borders of a neighboring country, no matter how many bribes it has paid in Washington, D.C. and at the United Nations. Standout crimes were important in the publicizing of Bosnia's anguish. In August 1995, a Serbian shell exploded in a Sarajevo market. The Bosnia Massacre killed 68 civilians and created a worldwide outcry that finally led to U.S. bombing of the Bosnian Serb militias. On January 21, 2022, last Friday, 83 civilians were slaughtered by a Saudi airstrike on a prison facility in Yemen. Nobody cares. Saudi crimes of this magnitude are not quite a weekly event in Yemen, but there are at least 1 or 2 a year that should become worldwide outrages. They almost never do. On August 9, 2018, the Saudi government blew up a school bus in Yemen, murdering 40 children. That too has been forgotten. Perhaps it's because the bombs used in both massacres were manufactured in the United States. The weight of a crime is subjective. It will probably be impossible to persuade many that the horrors of Yemen surpass those of Bosnia. Bosnia's horrors were perpetrated during the 1990s. It was a more peaceful, happier time for the developed world, and Serbian crimes will always carry greater cultural weight because of the contrast back then. What can be said objectively, however, is that U.S. guilt for the horrors in Yemen weighs far heavier than our guilt for Bosnia. In Bosnia, we were shamefully ineffectual bystanders. In Yemen, we are perpetrators. Let's pretend the actual crimes committed on the ground are equal. The case against the United States from 1991 to 1995 is that we did nothing in Bosnia, and that's largely accurate. Yugoslavia had been a member of the communist bloc and didn't have many U.S. weapons. We sanctioned every party to the conflict soon after it started. In fact, the main argument against the United States was that we sanctioned too much, and we probably should have sold some weapons to the persecuted Bosnian Muslims. In Yemen, the United States participates in and enables every single attack. Saudi Arabia's Air Force and Navy are jokes. They are very expensive, but the Saudi royal family has intentionally kept them weak and dependent on the United States to avoid creating a rival power center. For the first years of the conflict, the United States was providing aerial refueling to the Saudi child murder jets, free of charge. There was enough of an outcry against this to stop the practice, but Saudi Arabia's planes do not fly without U.S. contractors. They do not function without U.S. intelligence. Without U.S. missiles and U.S. government-approved arms contracts, the Saudis would have nothing to bomb Yemeni school buses with. Without the United States, Saudi Arabia would be roundly condemned for these massacres at the United Nations Security Council, instead of being celebrated for them. The blood of nearly 400,000 dead Yemenis is on my hands. And if you are a U.S. taxpayer, it's on your hands too. Let's be brutally honest about what's going on here. There was a political figure that occupied almost exactly the U.S. role in the Bosnian conflict. He stood at a distance, pretending to regret the bloodshed, while insisting all the time that there were somehow two sides to the conflict, and that the mass murderers were acting in self-defense. He would claim not to be involved, while he continued to arm and diplomatically support the baby killers. Under Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden, the United States has filled the role of Yemen's Slobodan Milosevic. Though that might be a little unfair to Slobodan Milosevic, we have 2 to 4 times as much blood on our hands as he did, and he would never have dared to support and arm the Bosnian Serb militias as openly as we have supported Saudi imperialism in Yemen.
It's long past time we end the forever wars, and we should end our support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen.
This was Joe Biden on the campaign trail in 2019. After a full year of his time in office, I think it's fair to call this what it really was.
And we should end our support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen.
This was bullshit. For much of 2021, the Saudi government seemed to believe it, though. They dialed back their participation in the war in Yemen, in fear that the Democrats were as good as their word and would react negatively to new outrages. They need not have worried. In October, the United States did nothing as the Saudis bribed the United Nations to shut down its Yemen war crimes inquiry. And in December, the U.S. went ahead and sold Saudi Arabia another $650 million worth of missiles. In recent weeks, masked in part by the Ukraine crisis, the Saudi and UAE attack on Yemen has been dramatically stepped up. Civilian deaths are mounting, and last week a Saudi attack knocked out the internet for the whole country for almost 5 days. Knowing all this, the fact that the United States is currently whining about the Houthis sending a missile or two towards the UAE isn't just comical, it's evil. 3 people were killed in the United Arab Emirates, and that's sad. 377,000 people have been killed in Yemen as a direct result of an invasion that the United Arab Emirates has helped lead. Complaining about Houthi attacks on the Gulf states is the moral equivalent of complaining about French and Polish resistance to the Nazis. Let me close by talking a bit more about the Houthis, the government that has controlled 80 to 85% of Yemen's population for the entirety of this war. They suck. They are brutal to any dissenters, they prioritize the fight for freedom over feeding their population, and they have certainly killed many civilians too. Their rallying slogan and flag is also very depressing. But you know who else was brutal to those they saw as collaborators? The Vietnamese, who threw out the French and the Americans in the 20th century. Oh, and also George Washington and the American founding fathers in the 18th century. Canada's first big English-speaking populations were British loyalist refugees from the United States, after all. Saudi Arabia's propagandists in Washington, D.C. like to pretend there is some kind of moral equivalence between an indigenous resistance movement and a foreign invader. There isn't. And because the Houthis are obviously winning, and always have been, historians will recognize that too. Historians will also see U.S. participation in this horror as a stain on our reputation far worse than any negligence in Bosnia. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and if you live in the United States, please call your congressperson and ask them what they are doing to end the nightmare in Yemen. Thanks.